Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maya Swope, and I am the Outreach Coordinator here at Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. We're excited to have you joining this afternoon for our Lunch with the Friends presentation. This is kind of kicking off our Boundary Waters Climate Week. As you may be familiar, the International COP26 Climate Summit is happening right now. So we really wanted to take this opportunity to have a more local look at some climate conversations here in Minnesota, specifically focused on the Boundary Waters. So today we are really excited to have you join. We'll be learning about the proposed PolyMet and twin metals mines and some of the carbon and other climate impacts that those could have on Minnesota here. I saw this presentation for the first time back last winter, and it's a really fascinating look at some of the things that we talk about when we are fighting sulfide mining here in Minnesota. So for anyone who has questions throughout the presentation, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So if you think of questions throughout, please feel free to enter those there, and we will have some time for that at the end. There's also a chat function if you have additional comments or are having any technological issues or anything like that that we can try to address. And I think other than that, we are good to go. So I'm excited to introduce you all to Dr. Steve Emerman. He owns Malach Consulting, and he, which is an it focuses on environmental mining, and he's kind of an expert in a lot of areas of this field, and so really excited to have him present today. And you're in good hands for this presentation. So I will go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Maya, and thanks to everyone for coming. I am Stephen Emerman. I'll be speaking on the climate change impact of the proposed PolyMet and twin metals mines. Maya mentioned that you can post questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. In addition to climate change and PolyMet and twin metals mines, I'm happy to answer any general questions about climate change or general questions about the PolyMet and twin metals mines that don't necessarily relate to climate change. Okay, so we'll proceed. This is me. I have a master's from Princeton University and PhD from Cornell University. I was a professor of hydrology for 31 years. I'm now retired and do full-time consulting on environmental impacts of mining. I've evaluated proposed and existing mining projects in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Oceania, everywhere except Antarctica. I've testified on mining before the U.S. House of Representatives and the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I'll be testifying before the European Parliament on mining issues in a couple of weeks. This photo was taken on my 60th birthday at the encampment at Standing Rock Indian Reservation, letting you know that very soon I'll be 65. Okay, so I'm discussing two proposed copper nickel mines, PolyMet and twin metals. If we look on the right-hand side diagram, we see the footprints, the project sites of those two mines being very close to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, a couple of miles, about 2 miles for the twin metals mine from the Boundary Waters Wilderness area. Okay, and I'm going to look at the greenhouse gas emissions by these proposed copper and nickel mines. Okay. So the first question being, what would we expect from these mines? Based upon trends in the mining industry, what would we expect the greenhouse gas emissions to be? And then what are these two mines actually projecting as the greenhouse gas emissions? And how do these two correspond? Okay, so first, just a little background on greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, quite a lot to this subject, but what I want to emphasize here is how are greenhouse gas emissions measured? Okay, first of all, carbon dioxide gets a lot of press, but a lot of other gases are greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is simply more abundant and more long-lived in the atmosphere. Actually, any gas molecule with 3 or more atoms is a greenhouse gas. So water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. Okay. Now, some of these greenhouse gases have more global warming potential per ton. So a ton of methane has the global warming potential of 25 tons of carbon dioxide, where a ton of nitrous oxide has the global warming potential of 298 tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, so we measure greenhouse gas emissions as tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, or we just say tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, so when I'll talk about tons of carbon dioxide, some of that could be methane, some of that could be nitrous oxide, but it would be the equivalent global warming potential of so many tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, now how we measure greenhouse gas emissions. First, what is called Scope 1 emissions. These are also called direct emissions or on-site emissions. These are the emissions that are released in the atmosphere from sources on the mine site controlled by the mining company. Okay, so actual emissions from the site. This could be emissions from blasting, diesel fuel consumption for drilling, loading, hauling, liquid propane gas consumption for heating. It includes whatever happens on the mine site. It could include destruction of forests and peatlands to create the mine site. If electricity generation or metal refining is occurring on the mine site, that would be included as Scope 1 emissions. Okay, and Scope 2 emissions, also called indirect emissions. These are emissions released into the atmosphere due to the consumption of an energy commodity not generated by the mining company. Okay, now in the case of PolyMet and twin metals, one thing they have in common is they will not generate their own electricity, nor will they do refining on site. They will purchase electricity from Minnesota Power that is within the state, and they'll export concentrates for refining overseas. Okay, so for these two mines, we could say the Scope 1 emissions plus the Scope 2 emissions are the greenhouse gas emissions within the state of Minnesota. There's one additional thing I'll add to that will come up later in terms of an in-state emission. Okay, now all other emissions are called Scope 3 emissions. Okay, so all other emissions generated indirectly by the mining activity and which are not controlled by the mining company. Okay, so this could be fabrication of a product that includes the mined metal. It could be the recycling of the metal. It could be the refining of the metal at some other location. It could be the greenhouse gas emissions from shipping the concentrate to the refining facility. Okay, when we say cradle to grave, that's everything from the ore body till the metal is finally permanently buried in a landfill. And that would be Scope 1 plus Scope 2 plus Scope 3 emissions. All the greenhouse gas emissions through the whole life of that piece of metal. Okay, now Scope 3 emissions, things like fabrication of a product, recycling of the metal, those are not normally reported, and there is not really a standard methodology for reporting that. We're going to consider something more restricted in this talk. I'm going to talk about cradle to gate. Okay, so the gate is when the metal is ready for fabrication into a product. So cradle to gate means Scope 1 plus Scope 2 plus shipping plus refining, and that's when we'll stop. Okay? So mining and greenhouse gas emissions. Mining is not a minor part of greenhouse gas emissions. This is from an article in Nature. It's most prestige science journal in the world, February 2020. Here's a quote from the abstract. A paper called Transparency on Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Mining to Enable Climate Change Mitigation. Okay, a quote from the abstract. Overall, we estimate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with primary mineral and metal production was equivalent to approximately 10% of the total global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. Okay, so mining accounts for 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, the abstract continues. For copper mining, fuel consumption increased by 130% and electricity consumption increased by 32% per unit of mined copper in Chile from 2001 to 2017, largely due to decreasing ore grade. Okay, so what's happening? As ore grades go down, as there's less copper in a ton of ore, you're still using the same amount of fuel to grind up all of that ore. Okay, so it means that for each ton of metal, you're using more fuel and you're using more electricity and you're creating more greenhouse gas emissions. It's simply a consequence of decreasing ore grades as the high-grade ores become exhausted. Okay, now in this respect, let's look at some key characteristics of the PolyMet and Twin Metals mines. Both mines are mining a sulfide ore. PolyMet would be open pit, Twin Metals would be underground. PolyMet would process 32,000 tons of ore per day. Twin Metals would process 20,000 tons of ore per day. PolyMet would produce 113,000 tons of copper concentrate per year and 18,000 tons of copper nickel hydroxide. Twin Metals would produce 174,000 tons of copper concentrate per year and 84,000 tons of nickel concentrate. But I especially want to draw your attention to the grades of the ore. PolyMet, 0.26% copper, 0.04% nickel. Twin Metals, 0.69% copper, 0.22% nickel. Those are very low ore grades, even in comparison with the low ore grades occurring globally at the present time. Okay, so I call PolyMet and Twin Metals ultra low grade ore. Let's look at a comparison. On the left-hand side, this diagram is just for Australia. So if we look at copper ores, those are the circles. Mid-19th century, copper ores were like 15 to 20% copper. By 1900 to 1930, those were all gone. Australia was mining ores that were 5% copper. And now on Australia, ore bodies are 1% copper, 1% nickel. That is fairly standard, at least in Australia. Okay, so 1% copper, 1% nickel. That is standard in the world today compared with PolyMet, 0.26% copper, 0.04% nickel. Twin Metals, 0.69% copper, 0.22% nickel. Okay, so PolyMet and Twin Metals be mining ultra low grade ore bodies. So we're really paying a premium in terms of fuel consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, electricity consumption to get the copper out of these low grade ores. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we can look at energy consumption as a function of ore grade. Okay, so what we see is on the y-axis, we have energy intensity. That's kilojoules of energy per ton of copper. That is per ton of copper metal. And on the x-axis is the ore grade, percent of copper. So we see as we go less than about 0.5% copper, we have a huge increase in energy per ton of copper metal. Okay, so really paying a premium for energy consumption for these very low grade ores. Same thing for greenhouse gas emissions. Look at the diagram on the right. On the y-axis, greenhouse gas emissions, kilograms of carbon dioxide per kilogram of copper metal. On the x-axis, the ore grade. And as we go to ore grades less than about 0.5%, okay, we're really paying a premium in a lot of greenhouse gas emissions for a kilogram or for a metric ton of copper. Okay, so these ultra low grade ore bodies not ideal for producing copper metal in terms of fuel consumption, electricity consumption, greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, now my goal was to apply the mining industry trends to the PolyMet and Twin Metals mines. Okay, so this was a report I wrote for Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. It's publicly available now. Comparison of projected greenhouse gas emissions with industry trends for the proposed PolyMet and Twin Metals copper nickel mines, northeastern Minnesota. Okay, so how did I get those mining industry trends? I was able to find 23 academic studies of energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions from copper and nickel mining. All these studies use different data sets, use different methodologies, all reach somewhat different conclusions. How did I apply all of that? Okay, so I asked the questions of all these studies, which ones are most applicable to the PolyMet and twin metals mines? Okay, so I had a set of priorities, one being the highest priority. Okay, so first, I favored the more recent studies. At the same time, estimates that were clear outliers I treated with great caution, even if they were more recent. In general, I prefer to choose estimates from a small set of studies rather than pick and choose estimates from many studies. Okay, second, I preferred estimates specific to the circumstances of the PolyMet and twin metals mines. Okay, so the case of on-site or in-state estimates, this meant choosing estimates specific to open pit mining for PolyMet or underground mining for twin metals. For cradle to gate estimates, that would include the greenhouse gas emissions or energy consumption from refining. I chose estimates specific to sulfide ores, called pyrometallurgy, process of extracting carbon and nickel from sulfide ores. And finally, since the ore grades are so low for PolyMet and twin metals mines, I favored on-site and in-state estimates that took that ore grade into account, or that looked at energy consumption per ton of ore, because you have to spend the energy to grind up all of the ore, regardless of how much metal is present in that ore. Okay, so let's just look at a few examples. What we're looking at here is various studies. So we have 8 studies that have looked at on-site diesel fuel consumption rates for production of copper concentrate. Okay, so we have various estimates we obtained by applying industry trends from those studies to the circumstances of the PolyMet and twin metals mines. The ones that I think are most applicable, I circle in red. So Rotzer and Schmidt 2020, that's the most recent study. We have an estimate for open pit mining, 166.36 terajoules per year. We have an estimate for underground mining, 113.91 terajoules per year. I regard those as most reliable. This was a very interesting study, Kopelar and Kopelar 2016. They looked at energy consumption as a function of both the ore grade and depth. I'm very hesitant to rely on that study because you get such very different results depending upon which aspects of the study you look at. If you take into account the grade and the depth, if you just look at results for open pit or just for underground, very hesitant about that study. So Rotzer and Schmidt is what I favor, even though it has the lowest diesel fuel consumption rates. Okay, here's another example. Electricity consumption rates for production of copper concentrate. In this area, we have 14 studies along these lines. Okay, for PolyMet mine, I am most relying on the study by Fagerstrom in 2015. Kopelar and Kopelar 2016 is more recent, but such a wide range of results depending upon which of their equations used. This last one by Brantz is really a clear outlier. Okay, in the case of the twin metals mines, I'm relying on Rotzer and Schmidt, okay, 2020. Okay, one more example, cradle to gate total energy consumption rates for copper production. This most recent study based on sulfide ore is Rankin in 2012. I applied both of those to the NorthMet mine and the Twin Metals mine. Northey et al. Is more reliable, somewhat hesitant to use that one. It's such a clear outlier to other studies. Okay, so some judgment was involved in here, but in each case, I decided which studies were most applicable to PolyMet and twin metals mines. Okay, so with that, we get the best estimates for these proposed mines based upon industry trends, applied to the PolyMet mine, applied to the twin metals mine. We have on-site estimates, that's scope 1 emissions. We have in-state estimates, that's scope 1 plus scope 2. And then what I call global estimates, so same thing as cradle to gate, that's scope 1 plus scope 2 plus shipping plus refining. Okay, now, important consideration is we have estimates for electricity consumption, but that must be converted to greenhouse gas emissions. And how you do that depends upon the power source. Okay, this diagram on the left that's coming from the final environmental impact statement for the PolyMet mine. Okay, so both of these mines will get their power from Minnesota Power. And actually, by Minnesota standards, Minnesota Power is a relatively inefficient generator of electricity in terms of greenhouse gases for a certain amount of electricity. Smaller providers, Xcel Energy, Alliant Energy, Ottertail Power are actually more efficient. Okay, so now here's the main thing. Compare the best estimates, the industry trends, and the projections by the mining company. Okay, so let's look at some interesting things here. For PolyMet, we have direct greenhouse gas emissions, 186,342 tons per year, carbon dioxide. Indirect greenhouse gas emissions, 511,000 tons per year. So for the PolyMet mine, the sum of the in-state emissions, 697,342 tons of carbon dioxide per year. That would be equivalent to 137,540 passenger vehicles. Okay, so the in-state emissions would be equivalent to putting 137,540 more passenger vehicles on the roads of Minnesota. For Twin Metals mine, direct greenhouse gas emissions, that is on-site emissions, 58,071 tons carbon dioxide per year. Indirect greenhouse gas emissions, 1,144,492 tons per year. Okay, so we get in-state emissions about 1,202,563 tons carbon dioxide per year. It's equivalent to putting onto Minnesota roads an extra 237,190 passenger vehicles. Okay, so we can look at those two mines together. It's equivalent to a little under 500,000 passenger vehicles on Minnesota roads. Okay, now, by the way, this is a way in which the in-state emissions were not included. Scope 1 plus Scope 2 is emissions on-site plus emissions from generating electricity from Minnesota Power. It does not include shipping, but there is going to be some shipping on Minnesota roads. Okay, so we consider Twin Metals, 258,000 tons of copper and nickel concentrates per year. Let's ship it to Duluth in two-ton trucks. That'd be 353 trucks per day, each truck doing a 200-mile round trip. This is a standard figure for 2-ton trucks for carbon dioxide emissions per ton miles. So shipping on Minnesota roads adds another 9,203 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Okay, now this is what we really want to do, is decide how much can we rely on the projections by the mining companies. That is, how do they compare with trends in the mining industry? Okay, so let's look at PolyMet. Direct greenhouse gas emissions by industry trends, 83,076 tons. PolyMet projects 186,342 tons. Okay, PolyMet is projecting more emissions than would be standard in the industry. Indirect greenhouse gas emissions from generation of electricity, industry trends for PolyMet, 271,149 tons. PolyMet projects 511,000 tons. Okay, so we see here is actually PolyMet is being appropriately conservative in projecting that they'll have more greenhouse gas emissions than are standard in the industry. And that is a correct procedure. Okay, so PolyMet is being appropriate here. I have many other criticisms of PolyMet, but not their projections of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. Now, twin metals is a different story. Okay, so we see based upon industry trends for direct greenhouse gas emissions, industry trends projects 157,293 tons, but twin metals says their greenhouse gas emissions will be 58,071 tons. Okay, so projections by twin metals for on-site greenhouse gas emissions are about 1/3 of mining industry trends. Okay, so why is that? But first, let's ask, why is that discrepancy so important? Okay, in fact, that is explained by twin metals themselves. Okay, this is a quote from their environmental assessment worksheet. Preliminary greenhouse gas emission calculations show carbon dioxide equivalent emissions would be 58,072 tons per year. Most important, which is well below the threshold for a major source of air emissions of 100,000 tons per year in Minnesota. This is based on the mine heaters being used at maximum capacity 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, and 6 months out of the year. Okay, so it's very important to twin metals to be below that threshold at 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. You're called a major source of air emissions in Minnesota. Okay, so the whole concept of major source of air emissions is connected with the Clean Air Act. Okay, if you're a major source of air emissions, you're supposed to have a PSD permit. PSD meaning prevention of significant deterioration. Okay, now there's various components to getting this PSD permit. They include installation of the best available control technology, a thorough air quality analysis, thorough additional impacts analysis of the impacts of these air emissions, and significant public involvement. And twin metals is really trying hard to not cross that threshold. Okay, but let's see how they do so. Okay, this is the worksheet from twin metals. And let's see how they arrived at that total greenhouse gas emissions of 58,071 tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, we only have two components to this worksheet. We have liquid propane gas for heating and its total greenhouse gas emissions. We have the water-based blasting emulsions and their associated greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so their on-site emissions are a sum of emissions from liquid propane gas and emissions from blasting. And if I was teaching an in-person class right now, I would say what's missing from this calculation. And I don't think I would proceed until a participant could name what was missing, but I will help you out and I will just tell you what is missing from here. Okay, what is missing is what about consumption of diesel fuel? Okay, so that same environmental assessment worksheet says that twin metals will be consuming 20,700,000 liters of diesel fuel. And what about those associated greenhouse gas emissions? There's no mention, that's not part of the calculation. So that's a significant missing factor. Okay, now that same document, twin metals also recognizes that's missing and they promise they'll take care of that later. Okay, so they say in the environmental impact study, greenhouse gas information would be refined by inclusion of greenhouse gas emissions from certain on-site mobile sources of emissions, including haul trucks and loaders. Okay, so that's all those consumers of diesel fuel. They will take care of that later. Okay, but the calculation really isn't that hard at all. If you know how much diesel fuel you'll be consuming, and they tell us, they say 20,700,000 liters of diesel fuel per year. Okay, well, that's well known. How many tons of carbon dioxide is emitted by burning a ton or a kilogram or whatever of diesel fuel. Okay, so we can easily add the diesel fuel greenhouse gas emissions to liquid propane gas and water-based blasting emulsions. So now we have 45,481 tons per year from liquid propane gas, 12,590 tons per year from water-based blasting emulsions, 61,091 tons of carbon dioxide per year from burning diesel fuel. Okay, so that gives us total on-site emissions of 119,162 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And now we have certainly crossed that threshold. We have crossed that threshold of 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Okay, but what else is missing here? What about greenhouse gas emissions from destruction of peatlands? Okay, all this information is coming from Twin Metals. The project area includes 912.4 acres of peatlands. That includes acid peatlands, forested rich peatlands, open rich peatlands. So all of those peatlands are going to be destroyed to create this mine. Okay, now how much carbon is being stored in these Minnesota peatlands? This is a report from Minnesota DNR. Loss of the carbon contained in 1,000 acres of peatland would release approximately 2.7 million metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, increasing Minnesota's total annual emission of carbon dioxide by 2% above 2005 levels. Okay, now we're talking about 912.4 acres of Minnesota wetlands, and this destruction will release 2,715,519 tons of carbon dioxide. Okay, keep in mind that the quote has been referred to metric tons, and now I'm doing the calculation in the US short ton. Okay, so for 25 years of operation, that would be 108,621 tons of carbon dioxide per year. But probably most of this carbon is going to be released in the first few years in constructing the mine site. Okay, but let's take this destruction of peatland and its associated carbon dioxide emissions, and let's average that over the 25 years of the mine project. Okay, so now we have an additional 108,621 tons of carbon dioxide per year. We're adding up emissions from liquid propane gas, water-based blasting emulsions, diesel fuel, and peatland construction. We now have total on-site emissions of 227,783 tons of carbon dioxide per year, meaning that with this most straightforward calculation, starting with estimates from Twin Metals, straightforward calculations based upon diesel fuel and peatland consumption, we can say that Twin Metals would far exceed the threshold for major source of greenhouse gas emissions, that is 100,000 tons per year. So this might just certainly be considered a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. But even this list is not complete. We have not included emissions from forest and wetland destruction, simply being peatlands, the major sources of carbon storage. Okay, so anyway, look at that list. What's number one on that list? Most important on that list is peatland destruction. Okay, now that is unavoidable. Okay, the major source of on-site greenhouse gas emissions is peatland destruction, and that is unavoidable. Okay, we might say there might be less diesel fuel consumption. Twin Metals uses electric vehicles, they use robots, they use other technological advances, but this conversion of peatland into a mine site is unavoidable, is inevitable. And simply the peatland destruction itself marks the Twin Metals mine as a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so to summarize, three major points. Low-grade ore bodies result in high greenhouse gas emissions per quantity of copper and nickel. According to mining company projections, inside emissions by the PolyMet and Twin Metals mines would be equivalent to 137,540 passenger vehicles on Minnesota roads for the PolyMet mine, and for the Twin Metals mine, an additional 237,190 passenger vehicles on Minnesota roads. But in this respect, I'm not including the emissions from transportation related to carrying these products from the mines to shipping ports in Duluth. Third, the projected on-site emissions by the Twin Metals mines are about 1/3 of mining industry trends, even taking the low-grade ore into account. This low projection places Twin Metals well below the threshold for a major source of air emissions. Okay, fourth point, including diesel fuel consumption and peatland destruction would place Twin Metals far above the threshold for a major source of air emissions. And finally, the major source of on-site emissions is peatland destruction. This is inevitable. It's simply a consequence of constructing a mine at that location. This will not be affected by electric vehicles or robots or other technological advances. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Maya.
Great, yeah. And if you would just go to that next slide,
Okay.
I can talk a little bit about this before we jump into questions.
Okay.
I'm hoping that this kind of presentation is urging folks to take action, and would just ask you to visit our Prove It First website. So this would be a bill that would hopefully stop both Twin Metals and PolyMet, but basically would ask any company that wants to build a sulfide mine in Minnesota to first prove that it can be done safely. And you can learn more about that at the website here. And then also we're asking folks to become delegates in their local precinct caucuses. So that's if you live in Minnesota. And you can email me for more info about that. And I won't go super detailed into those now, but so we can jump to our Q&A. But look out for a follow-up email from me with links and more information about that.
Okay. Maya, would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
Yes, I think that would be great. And then we can answer some questions. So just a reminder to everybody who's listening in, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom. So if you want to answer or enter any of your questions there, that would be the easiest way for us to kind of get to them. And I think I just kind of want to start off, not a question exactly, but just a comment that, you know, as we're talking about the COP26, this climate summit, and as we were hearing local Minnesota leaders talk about climate change and Minnesota's climate action plans, it's kind of ridiculous to, you know, see that these mines are still proposed to go forward from those very same leaders when we can see that, you know, they clearly are going against a lot of the climate goals that we as a state and as a community are trying to accomplish. And I think that the 500,000 vehicles added to the road, that number really stands out to me.
If you don't mind, I'd like to respond to your last comment.
Yeah.
Okay. Just another thing to consider is that if someone argued that in order to address climate change, we need more copper, if you made that argument, the Boundary Waters wilderness area and its neighborhood would be the worst possible location for that. Okay. The first reason being it's an extremely low-grade ore. Okay. It does not make sense to expend the fuel, the electricity, create the greenhouse emissions to pull the copper out of such a low-grade ore. Okay, the other point being that your worst possible choice would be an irreplaceable, valuable ecosystem. And I put the Boundary Waters into that category. Okay, so mining a low-grade copper nickel ore from a precious, valuable ecosystem would be the worst possible choice.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm looking through the chat and the Q&A. Mike is asking, what are the implications of exceeding that 100,000 GHG emissions? Does it affect the permitting? And what are the increased costs to mine?
Okay. If you exceed the 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year threshold, you're now called a major source of air emissions. Okay, that does significantly increase the costs of getting the permit and operating the mine. It puts you in a whole different category. Okay, you now have to have special permit called a PSD permit, which means prevention of significant deterioration. And there's many more parts to this, okay? You have to show that you're using the best available control technology. You have to have a very thorough analysis of what the air emissions are going to be, a very thorough analysis of what will be the impacts of those emissions, human health impacts, and so on. There's supposed to be much more significant public involvement, okay? Trying to pretend like you're below that threshold is a way of trying to fly under the radar, okay? When even the simplest calculation shows the twin metals mine will be easily twice that threshold, okay? So it does present significant new costs to the mining operation to recognize that you're above the threshold for a major source of air emissions.
Thank you for that answer. Let's see. We've got somebody in the Q&A asking if the price of energy increases based on Minnesota Power's recent request for rate increases and the passage of a proposed price on carbon in Congress. When does the cost of energy make these mines economically non-viable? And is there, a price hike in energy increases that would contribute to the mines not finding that useful anymore?
Okay, okay, that's an excellent question, okay, which is what happens to the mining operation as a whole, what happens to their balance sheet if you have an increase in their cost of their inputs, like their electricity consumption, okay? That's not a simple question I can answer off the top of my head, okay? But I can explain to you where you would go for that to try to analyze that information, okay, is that both of these mining projects have feasibility studies, they have technical reports. That's the information they provide to their investors, okay? So that information needs to have a very detailed cost analysis, what they're projecting their costs of electricity, how that affects their overall balance sheet. That number I gave for twin metals for their projected electricity consumption, that's coming out of the feasibility report that they provided to investors, okay? And those kinds of reports to investors should have a kind of sensitivity analysis that is saying, well, what if the electricity cost goes up significantly? How does that affect the balance, okay? But certainly as a factor, at what point does the mining operation no longer become profitable? It's not a simple question I can answer, okay? But it's certainly a factor to keep in mind, take into account.
I see that Linda in the Q&A is asking if the statistics that you've presented have been shared with regulatory agencies as expert opinions, or what the process for that has looked like.
Oh, okay. So the expert report that I wrote was written for Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness, okay? So I've been a consultant for the Friends, and that's how consulting works, is you work for their client, you work for your client, okay? You don't work for other parties interested in the same issue, okay? So that's a question for the Friends to answer, is how have they shared that report?
Yeah, and I know that from our perspective, I know we have passed it along to certain policymakers and other people in Minnesota, and I think we'll continue to kind of, spread that to different leaders here. I see a question from Leslie, and maybe you will know the answer to this. The PT and PD says that platinum and something else give the most economic return from the mines. How do these metals affect the estimates?
Okay, so so for example, the Twin Metals mine is primarily a copper nickel mine. It's also producing some platinum group elements, palladium, platinum, some others. Okay. Sorry, what was the particular question about that? I didn't quite miss.
Let me just pull that up. So asking if PT and PD, Sarah's saying PT and PD give the most economic return from the mines. How do these metals affect the estimates?
Okay, so do the platinum group elements give the most return for the mine? I don't know if I'm persuaded of this, okay? That's possible. I haven't really seen a calculation that argues this. They're certainly producing much more copper and nickel than these platinum group elements, okay? Now, if we ignore the copper and nickel, then the calculations become quite a bit more difficult in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, okay? Because there's a lot of study on greenhouse gas emissions by copper mines. There's a lot of copper mines in the world. There's studies on greenhouse gas emissions by nickel mines. There actually are no studies for copper nickel mines, okay? There's the mines that produce both, okay? So in my report, I explained some reasoning, okay, how I combined estimates from both copper mines and nickel mines, okay? In terms of looking at industry trends for mining of platinum group elements, you're talking about a very small database there, okay? I am aware of a couple studies from Australia, but you're talking about a pretty small database, okay? Otherwise, that would be an interesting question, okay? To just ask, well, what is typical for mines that produce platinum? And if you then apply that to the twin metals mines, what estimates would you get, okay? Yeah, that would be interesting. It is primarily a copper nickel mine, okay? Just to add a bit more, the most important thing here in terms of fuel consumption, energy consumption, the most important thing is how much ore you have to grind up, okay? So you have to grind up all of that ore regardless of how much copper, nickel, platinum is present, okay? So my guess is simply looking at this primarily as a platinum mine is not really going to affect my estimates so much.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and thanks for the response to that. I see a couple of questions here, and this is something that I was wondering about as well. If you could just talk more about the environmental impact of shipping all of the materials to Duluth or to other places each day. Rob had a question: has anyone figured out the environmental impact on the roads that need to be built or the trucks to accommodate the transportation piece of it?
Okay, well, in terms of the roads or the infrastructure, it's not something that that I have examined. Presumably, all those trucks are going to take the same route every day. Okay, and if you're on that route that sees, I think I said 353 trucks per day. Okay, so if you have 353 trucks go by your house per day, every day for the next 25 years, it's really something that you're going to be aware of. Okay, in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, I calculated all of that would be equivalent to about 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. Okay, so that, yes, that certainly is a significant factor. The impact on roads, I don't have an answer to, but it certainly is significant. I mean, the overall impact on quality of life of people who live along that route certainly would be significant.
Yeah, I can imagine that would not be pleasant to have all those trucks going by your house in northern Minnesota like that. Just diving into a few of these other questions. Somebody is asking, it's clear from your presentation and from what we know that this is not a good idea to start with. I wonder if you have data of the kind of impact that similar types of mining has had in nearby areas, as well as the timing. For example, if mining proceeds, when are we expecting to see water contamination, fish species disappearing, other things like that? And I know that's a little bit outside of the scope of this report, but I wonder if you have any information on that.
Okay, so yeah, this is a very good question in terms of what tends to be the impacts from copper nickel mining when you see those impacts develop, et cetera. Okay, and this is connected with the whole discussion about prove it first. Okay, so I don't mind kind of sidestepping into that area.
Great, yeah.
Okay. So what the prove it first bill is about, of course, Maya can say more about that if you like to, okay, is that the type of ore body that would be mined is called a sulfide ore body, okay? And sulfide ore bodies tend to generate acid mine drainage and tend to have significant impacts in terms of water pollution, also air pollution, but mostly water contamination. And these ore bodies are very different than the kind of ore bodies, oxide ore bodies that are mined for iron in Minnesota. Okay, so currently, and I don't think any time, there's been no mining of sulfide ore bodies in Minnesota. So that's a new thing for Minnesota, okay? Now, what the Prove It First law says is that if you want to mine a sulfide ore body in Minnesota, show us an example of where this has been done safely somewhere else in the US. Okay, so where in the US has there been a sulfide ore mine that has operated for 10 years without water pollution? Where is there a sulfide ore body somewhere in the US, anytime, anywhere, that has been closed for 10 years without water pollution? Okay, and Wisconsin had a similar law. It was passed in 1997. And there were certain mines that were proposed as examples of these clean mines, clean sulfide mines that are operated without water pollution. And all of those proposed mines were discredited. That is, it wasn't true. There actually were records of water pollution. There were violations of regulations, there were academic studies, etc. Okay? Now, no one ever found an example of a clean mine that would pass that Wisconsin law. The way that mining companies got around it, if they had the law repealed. Okay, so that law was repealed in 2017. Okay? Now, in this discussion now about the Prove It First bill, is it a good idea? Is it necessary? People are suggesting, well, there's mines that they have operated without water pollution. They're the exact same mines that were proposed as rebuttals to the Wisconsin law and were discredited. Okay, so those exact same mines that were called clean mines as a way to try to get around the Wisconsin law, those same mines are being recycled as examples of clean mines, even though they've all have already been discredited. Okay, it means there aren't any new examples for anyone to come up with, meaning there aren't any examples. Okay, I'm not saying it's impossible to operate a copper nickel sulfide mine without water pollution, but it's never happened. Okay, it's never happened anywhere in the US, under any circumstances. It's never happened. Okay, if it was possible in Minnesota, it would be the first time that's ever happened. Okay, but Minnesota, I understand Minnesota is saying, wait a minute, we're not the guinea pigs here. Okay, let someone else be the guinea pig. Okay, let someone else show we've had a clean mine in our state without water pollution, but there simply are no examples of that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of jump on that Prove It First point a little bit, this law will really, if we can get it passed, and that is, one of the things that we at the Friends are really focusing on in these coming years, will allow us to require some more science in our permitting process in Minnesota and some more verification. That is, I think, a really good thing overall, both, when we're talking about specifically twin metals or PolyMet, but also any proposed future mines, any mines in other parts of the state. It would really kind of improve our process in general, in addition to stopping, these particular mines that we are fighting here. And as I mentioned before, you will see a follow-up email from me that has a link to those details on Prove It First, as well as an ask for folks who are on the call here to become Prove It First delegates at your local caucuses this winter. And I'm just kind of looking at the time here. I don't want to go much past the hour, so I will start to wrap up. And I realize that we are not able to get to all of the questions that are here, but please feel free to reach out to me if anyone has follow-up questions that we weren't able to address. And I really want to kind of highlight a couple of things that we have going on this week in our Friends of the Boundary Waters world. So we are kind of Climate Week overall, and we have a couple other presentations coming up later on. So tomorrow at noon, we will be hearing from Bill Rahm, who grew up in Ely and is now a professor at the NYU School of Public Health. So he'll be talking about climate and public health, and I think that'll be a really interesting way to continue thinking about this. And then on Thursday, we will have also at noon a presentation from Lee Frelich at the University of Minnesota, who has some really interesting studies that he's done on the Northern Boreal Forest and how climate change will affect that and affect, what the boundary waters will look like in, 20, 50, 100 years. So tune into both of those. I will put in the chat the link to all of that information, so that is in there right now, so you can sign up for both of those there. And yeah, I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Emerman. This is super interesting and such important science for us here in Minnesota. Thank you to all of you for tuning in. Really appreciate you being engaged in protecting the boundary waters and in fighting for a safe and healthy climate for all of us. One last plug, it is our Give to the Max week next week. So Give to the Max Day is one of the largest fundraising days for us at the Friends, and to keep this work going, keep doing projects like this, we really rely on support from all of you to make it happen. So I, again, will put that link in the chat where you can sign up to support us. We do have a match going on right now, so every dollar that you donate will be doubled. So that's kind of a really exciting way to contribute to all of this. So Dr. Emerman, any final words before we close out for the afternoon?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Okay. I do think it's important for the audience to give careful consideration to this prove it first concept. If you can't run a mine without water pollution anywhere else ever, what makes it possible in Minnesota? This idea actually is catching on. I believe Buckingham County, Virginia also has a prove it first ordinance, and the country of Ecuador has such a bill before their National Assembly. So think about it, give it some thought.
Yes, great. Well, what a good note to end on. Thanks again for joining us, and thank you for a great presentation. And hopefully we will see everybody tomorrow afternoon. Thanks, everybody.